Hello. One of the great mysteries of the 70 or so years at the end of the 15th century to the middle of the 16th century was something called the sweating sickness. And I was put in mind of that when I saw this video. Doubtless you've seen it too, or something similar. And there's another one here. Especially with the first one. As soon as I saw it, I was reminded of a diary entry by a visiting Frenchman to England in the mid-1500s. The man was called Thomas Forestier, and he was a doctor. So this weird illness he was observing was of interest to him beyond the simple fear of catching it himself. This is what he said. "We saw two priests standing together and speaking together, and we saw both of them die suddenly. Also, in the proximity, we saw the wife of a tailor taken and suddenly died. Another young man walking by the street fell down suddenly." It was that particularly reminded me of that. Well, I was reminded of that by the video. Now, according to what is being said so far about the coronavirus, which came out of China at the end of last year, it's a coronavirus, and coronaviruses can be spread by just about any old animal, apparently, which is why every week there's a new theory about which particular animal started it. I've heard of bats and pangolins, and they really can't, they're just thrashing about at the moment. The sweating sickness, or it's sometimes called the English sweating sickness, or to sound posh, pseudo anglicus, was caused, they tell us, by a hantavirus. Apparently the two are completely different. Well, they may be, but the description of them is very similar. First of all, there's that description by Thomas Forestier of people being perfectly well 1 minute, apparently, suddenly collapsing and then dead within a few hours. Obviously, nowadays, the death part of it wouldn't be so common because we have ventilators. But of course, they don't always work. But even so, they certainly would make a difference, and there would have been far more deaths without them, undoubtedly. The other thing about English sweating sickness, oh, by the way, it was called that because, well, mostly it was confined to England. And interestingly enough, to the strongest and richest people too. It seemed to hit the upper classes more than the lower classes, and they haven't worked that one out at all. English sweating sickness and the coronavirus both have the ability to reinfect the same victim. There were cases noted by doctors at the time of the same person being hit 2 or 3 times, and usually they may have recovered from the first attack or even the second, but the third finished them off. Another similarity, just a minute, Cardinal Wolsey got 2 attacks of sweating sickness about 10 years apart. I'll find out the dates and I'll put it up there. Another similarity between the present coronavirus, which apparently does reinfect, and the English sweating sickness was that it's obvious that in both cases the disease was asymptomatic in some people for very long periods. that can be the only answer. That chap who fell over in that Chinese thoroughfare and the other fellow, they obviously felt okay to walk about when they started out. And then they started to become ill and realized they could go no further and then just dropped. And that's what seems to have happened to those priests that Forestier noted. They were standing talking to each other. They weren't just struck, they must have been ill for hours, days, possibly even weeks before they succumbed. And it's likely that the waves of infection which hit England between 1485 and 1551 were not so much infection as reinfection from people who might have spent years with the disease dormant in their systems. That's my theory, by the way. I've not seen that written down. Cardinal Wolsey got the sweating sickness in 1517. Yeah, and then again in 1528. That's right. And, you know, it could have been that he actually caught the disease twice, but it's equally possible he had the disease the whole time and it just popped up, which is a depressing thought, isn't it? John Keyes, an English doctor who specialised in this illness, actually he became so wealthy off it that he endowed Cambridge College. John Keyes remarked in a publication, now let's see, a book or counsel against the disease commonly called the sweat or sweating sickness, which was published in 1552. And he says that people ran to other countries like Ireland, Scotland and France to try to escape, but they developed the illness anyway in their new residences, which means they had it with them already. He said it followed Englishmen like a shadow. But the important thing about it was its apparent suddenness. Edward Hall, a diarist who lived about that time, Henry VIII's time, he records that this malady killed some within 2 hours, some merry at dinner and dead at supper. Again, I said, they were obviously already ill and they didn't know it. So although modern medical science tells me that this latest coronavirus is a coronavirus and completely different from the sweating sickness, which was a hantavirus, in my opinion, a non-medical opinion, there are enough similarities for me to draw the conclusion that they may be different, but they fill the same niche and do the same job. And we're probably going to have fewer deaths from this one because we have better medicines and better practices, but it's still a reminder that there are great mysteries to disease even today. As for the consequences, well, it's quite possible that the coronavirus will have some serious effects on the Chinese economy. I've already told you in a previous video about an article of clothing which I ordered through Amazon from China, and finally the people said they'd give me a refund because they couldn't fill the order. They didn't say why. They suggested maybe my address was odd, but it wasn't because they'd already sent me an item. No, they just couldn't tell me that their factory had probably closed down because of quarantine or, illness. Now, China has a history of great social upheavals and chaos. They're usually caused by famines, but it's quite possible that in this case, there might be a similar upheaval caused by economic collapse. And I have to remind you that we depend quite a bit on Chinese produce. So we're all going to have, well, to be feeling some of the effects beyond the medical ones. Once I was talking to the man who owned the factory that made a pair of riding boots I'd bought. And he was very proud to tell me he was the last factory in Britain to manufacture riding boots. All the rest are imported. And he then went on to say that we couldn't declare a war against China because the Chinese make all the army boots. Well, no more army boots, possibly. But social upheaval caused by epidemics, they've happened before, of course. The language I speak, the society in which I live, the nature and composition of the entire Western world were caused by the sweating sickness. Henry VII, that's Henry VIII's father, Henry VII had two sons. Arthur was the oldest, and Henry, the younger, was destined for the church. When the 15-year-old Arthur died of the sweating sickness, he left a widow, 16-year-old Catherine of Aragon, who had been sent from Spain and had married Arthur just 5 months previously. Henry VII was then faced with a conundrum. He was a famous tightwad, and he didn't want to send Catherine back because that would have meant he would have had to send her dowry as well. So he arranged to have Catherine marry the second son, Henry. And after Catherine became queen, with Henry, she produced no other child but Mary. And after that, it was just one miscarriage after the other. After a while, Henry, who was obsessed with the idea of having a son, he also said he was convinced that his marriage was cursed by God because the marriage was incestuous. In the Christian tradition, a married man and woman become one flesh. It's still there in the service. That is, spiritually, they are one person. So technically, Henry had been married off to his sister. Just to go off at a tangent, we all know that in Hamlet, the thing that obsesses Hamlet is the fact that his mother was sinfully having conjugal relations with her late husband's brother. I always had an idea that Shakespeare made much of this because it actually validated Queen Elizabeth by stressing the complete impossibility of Henry VIII's union with Catherine. That would make Elizabeth the first child born to Henry of a legal and religiously permitted wife, Anne Boleyn. But that's another story. However, the point is that when Henry requested of the Pope that his marriage to Catherine be annulled, the Pope refused. That was Clement VII. I'll put a picture of him here. Now, Clement VII was quite a broad-minded man, and he was quite a modern man as well for his time, and possibly he would have acceded to the request. After all, it was entirely reasonable by Catholic law, except it just so happened that he was in the power at the time of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. Picture of him there. And Charles V was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. My old history teacher told us we could remember that little fact by reminding ourselves that Catherine of Aragon was Charlie's aunt. Anyway, Charlie told the Pope to stay off, which is what impelled Henry to break with Rome and started England on a new non-European course. It also meant that the people from England who ended up going to North America were Protestants, with ideas of freedom and self-determination and building a new Eden in a new world, as opposed to the Spanish, of course, who were soldiers with no such ideas of Edens. They just did what soldiers did at the time. They went to the Americas to conquer and to loot. And that, children, is why the world is today as it is. And the sweating sickness was what caused it. It will be interesting to see what the coronavirus might cause. If you want to donate or contact, the information will be rolling over the Graniopteryx as I speak. Please like, subscribe and share because it does help with the algorithm. If you visit my channel on YouTube and one day discover that I've disappeared without warning, you'll still find me on BitChute or Minds. Just go to either of those platforms and do a search for Graniopteryx. If you're already watching this on BitChute or Minds, good for you. Meanwhile, if you're watching this on YouTube, remember that you must keep checking the subscribe and bell icons because occasionally they reset. Till next time.